On December the 7th, 1941, as World War II raged, the focus of attention was snatched from the battlefields of Europe and diverted to the smoke and flames rising from the American naval base in Hawaii, Pearl Harbor. The empire of the rising sun had finally struck, piercing the heart of the US Navy in a bid to ensure that their plans for an Asian empire, every bit as ambitious as Adolf Hitler's Thousand-Year Reich, were not threatened. But as the injured were rushed to safety and America reeled from the shock of the Japanese attack, those battling against Hitler, most notably Winston Churchill and the people of Great Britain, were able to find some comfort in the tragedy, because America's President, Franklin D. Roosevelt, could now justify bringing the United States into the war.
A state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
The story of Pearl Harbor may have been told many times, but it's nonetheless always fascinating, and in this programme we'll have the opportunity to revisit the events of that monumentous day as they unfolded, from the bombing of the USS Panay to the attack on Pearl Harbor itself, while discovering the reasons why the Japanese fleets travelled far across the ocean to pick a fight with World War II's sleeping giant. To begin at the beginning, it's necessary to appreciate that America and Japan were two nations that had developed in very different worlds, both geographically and culturally. As a chain of islands in the East Pacific, Japan had lived in the shadow of the giant kingdom of China for many centuries, and the Japanese tradition of the ancient samurai was deeply ingrained in the warrior-like people. They were taught that honour was more sacred than life itself, as other nations that attempted to invade Japan quickly discovered. By the 17th century, Western traders and missionaries were venturing closer to the kingdoms of the Far East, but the Japanese, who were suspicious of their motives, closed their ports, and it became a very dangerous place for those who dared to step ashore. Far across the Pacific Ocean in the Americas, northern European pilgrims were settling with more success. By July the 4th, 1776, the United States claimed its independence from the United Kingdom, after the American colonists refused to be governed by the British. However, tucked away in their hermit kingdom, the Japanese were blissfully unaware of the unrest in the Americas, and that the nation that would prove to be their most deadly enemy had fought its way into existence. It was a new age, and as time moved on, the great industries of the Western world developed. By the 19th century, there were ships travelling to the Far East in search of wealth that carried heavy armaments to protect their interests, and even a hermit kingdom like Japan was under threat. Soon it was clear that despite their warrior traditions, the Japanese would not be able to repel the encroaching ships forever. In 1854, a great fleet loomed on the horizon, led by the American Commodore, Admiral Matthew Perry. Tales of his victories in the Mexican-American War had spread as far as Japan, and the nation knew that this time they would have no choice but to open their ports. Within 4 years, the Americans had secured treaties to guarantee trade with Japan, and the Netherlands, Russia, Britain and France swiftly followed with their own agreements for trading rights. The Japanese came to know them as the shameful, unequal treaties. While Japan started to trade with the merchants of the West, America began a period of expansion, following the example of the British and the French. First came the purchase of the vast land of Alaska from the Russian Empire, with its endless forests and streams glittering with gold. In the Spanish-American War of 1898, it won Spanish land in the Pacific, the Philippine Islands and Guam, along with Puerto Rico in the Caribbean. The same year, America annexed the archipelago of Hawaii, which had first been explored by Captain Cook over 100 years earlier. As well as such treasures as sugar cane and pineapples, there was a natural harbour teeming with pearl-producing oysters. Recognizing its potential, the Americans soon created a naval base from where they could comfortably reach their new territory in the Pacific. While the United States enjoyed the fruits of its expansion, Japan, influenced by the industrial development of the West, began to take giant strides in improving its military prowess. It called on advisors from abroad to develop its army, which it began modelling on French battalions and later the Prussian army, which had become the most dominant force in Europe. The naval fleet, on the other hand, was based on the British Royal Navy, and by the turn of the century would impress the world when it defeated the mighty Russians at sea. In 1904, the Kingdom of the Russian Tsar was venturing dangerously close to Korea, the country Japan regarded as their safety buffer. In a magnificent assault, Admiral Togo led his naval forces into a surprise attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur in northeastern China. 18 months later, Japan celebrated their victory, and Togo would go down in history as the Nelson of the East, to be forever worshipped by Japanese naval officers. By the outbreak of World War I in 1914, the British called on Japan's naval power to aid the nations of the Entente powers in their fight against the Prussian armies. And it wasn't long before Japan had the third most significant naval force in the world. The largest was that of the British, followed by the Navy of the United States. Nevertheless, by the armistice of 1918, fears began to emerge of a new naval arms race, similar to the Anglo-German dreadnought race, which had been instrumental in starting the First World War. Consequently, America, Britain, France, Italy, and Japan signed the Washington Naval Treaty, ensuring that the size of their ships and fleets were limited. Japan, already disgruntled with America's handling of the Portsmouth Treaty after the Russo-Japanese War at Port Arthur, were unhappy about the limits that had been set, and the rift between the United States and the Japanese Empire began to deepen. Matters worsened when the Wall Street crash of 1929 dealt a devastating blow to the Japanese economy. The Imperial Army, much bolder and aggressive than the Japanese Navy, pressed for an invasion of northeastern China, a region rich in resources. In 1931, the more nationalist factions of the military drove their troops into Manchuria, and before the government in Tokyo could put a halt on the action, the conflict with China was gaining momentum. While Chiang Kai-shek, China's military leader, battled against the Imperial Army of Japan, led by Hideki Tojo, the government of the United States was doing all they could to preserve a stable economy and ensure that they stayed out of foreign wars. America had been gravely affected by the Wall Street crash and was struggling in the depression that had hit its people so hard. There was, however, some improvement by the mid-30s, and with President Franklin D. Roosevelt at the helm, America seemed to be well on the road to economic recovery, but there were now more pressing threats looming large. The fascist leader, Mussolini, like the Japanese military, was looking to grasp new territory and had marched his troops into Africa, seizing Abyssinia, and soon after, in 1936, civil war broke out in Spain and the country became embroiled in bloody battles. Haunted by the memory of thousands of lives lost in the First World War, America was reluctant to be dragged into another European conflict, and neutrality acts were passed to keep it isolated from struggles beyond its shores. Nevertheless, as the Japanese continued to march through China, America would find it increasingly difficult to keep its isolationist composure, looking on from the sidelines. By 1937, Japan had renounced the Washington Treaty, and the battle against China had escalated into a raging war. General Tojo had seized Shanghai and was driving his army south towards China's capital, Nanjing. There were many in the government who were appalled that the military seemed to be pushing forward on their own initiative, and before long, Tokyo would find itself at the heart of a diplomatic crisis. Eventually, Tojo's army reached Nanjing by December 1937 and proceeded to wreak havoc on the city and its inhabitants. Fleeing the horrors of Nanjing, the last of the Western civilians evacuated the city and boarded the USS gunboat Panay. The next day, to the horror of the ship's captain, Japanese naval planes began to dive towards the Panay, which was clearly marked as a US vessel, blasting it with bombs. The moment was immortalized by an American newsreel cameraman on board, and the ship sank slowly to the bottom of the Yangtze River. Although most were rescued, many people had been badly injured, and 3 Americans had been killed. The newsreel of the attack was rushed to Washington to be screened by Roosevelt, and while the president deliberated on what action to take, back in the Far East, the American ambassador Joseph Grew feared the event would lead to war. This seemed even more likely, as the extreme factions of Japan's military were determined to drive the United States out of Asia and were keen to encourage a conflict. But there were others who were mortified by the attack. Letters of apology began to flood in from Japanese civilians and even schoolchildren to the American ambassador in Tokyo. Vice Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto formally apologized to the United States. He was a Harvard man who'd spent time as a naval attaché in America and was well aware of the extent of the country's considerable naval power. He had also bitterly opposed the invasion of Manchuria and the subsequent war in China, and his views were making him increasingly unpopular with Japanese pro-war militarists. As the Japanese government waited with bated breath for Roosevelt's response on Christmas Eve, the president finally accepted their apology. Ironically, 4 years later, it would be Yamamoto who would reluctantly lead his country into World War II when he masterminded the attack on Pearl Harbor. While Japan continued ravaging China, bombing cities and mercilessly killing civilians, Roosevelt became less convinced of America's isolationist stance. Americans were becoming increasingly disturbed by tales of atrocities in China, and 1 year after the Panay incident, America placed an embargo on the sale of aircraft to Japan and began building up its naval forces, as well as ensuring China was supplied with aid in the fight against the imperial armies. There was also growing concern over the persecution of Jews in Germany and Austria. By now, Adolf Hitler was becoming a prominent figure on the political battlefield, as the German nation attempted to rebuild itself, and there were fears that another world war was on the horizon. On September 1st, 1939, Hitler's Nazi army stormed across the border into Poland, devastating towns and cities with air and land attacks, advancing swiftly towards the capital, Warsaw. Two days later, France and Britain declared war on Germany. The European conflict had begun, and for Roosevelt and the Americans, remaining neutral would prove even more difficult as the war progressed. Japan, meanwhile, took advantage of the situation on the European continent. By 1940, Paris had fallen, and the pro-Nazi Vichy government had stepped into office, gaining control of France and French territory in Africa and the Pacific. Indochina, better known today as Vietnam, was providing a useful route for aid to China, and determined to block American supplies, Japan decided to make an agreement with French officials so troops could be moved in. On September the 22nd, 1940, the Japanese and the French Vichy government, now controlling Indochina, signed an accord which granted transit rights through the country, although the number of troops allowed would be limited. But soon after the agreement was made, fighting broke out between Japanese and French troops. Within 4 days, ports and airfields were seized by Imperial soldiers, enabling them to have their warplanes stationed within range of American territory in the Philippines. Also, as the cities of the United Kingdom came under attack from German bombers in the Blitz, the Japanese looked towards the British imperial outposts of Singapore and Hong Kong. But first, they demanded that Winston Churchill close the British-held route through Burma that was now the only way aid could reach China. With the battle for the Atlantic to consider as well, the British Prime Minister had no ships at his disposal to defend territories in the Pacific, so he had little choice but to give in to the demands of the Japanese, and the Burma Road was closed. By now, increasingly concerned with Japanese hostility on a global scale, Roosevelt had moved the American fleet from its base in California to Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, edging ever closer to the Japanese arena of conflict. To the servicemen stationed at the tropical paradise, however, it was a dream come true. With beaches, glorious weather, and any potential enemy over 3,000 miles away to the west, there was little thought of war. Despite the Americans' determination to stay out of the conflict, Roosevelt had by this time brought in the Selective Service Act, which required all males between 21 and 36 to register. Described as essential preparation, in case the USA came under attack, Roosevelt was ever watchful of the Japanese, especially in the Pacific, and as events progressed, the American president's concern would prove to be more than justified. With the blockade on supplies to China now in place, Japan began to plan its next move. The Japanese Prime Minister, Konoye, had started to advocate the policy of a Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. The islands of the South Pacific were rich in resources, so while Europe was concerned with battling against the Nazis, Japan could push the Western powers out of the Pacific to create their own Asian empire. America had been cutting back oil supplies to Japan since the summer, and the Dutch East Indies had crucial supplies. By September the 27th, there was another turn in the twisting world of international politics when the Japanese Foreign Minister, Matsuoka, added his signature to the tripartite pact between Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. The two European dictators approved of Japan working towards an Asian empire, and as the three nations were united, the Japanese moved ever closer to a conflict with the United States and the Allied forces. Yamamoto, who was by now commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, made his opposition to such a pact clear. He was well aware of the immense naval power of the United States, and felt that many took the prospect of a Japanese-American war far too lightly. His warning could not have been clearer when he said, "It is not enough that we take Guam and the Philippines, nor even Hawaii and San Francisco. To make victory certain, we would have to march into Washington and dictate the terms of peace in the White House." The question could not have been simpler. Was the Japanese government prepared to make the necessary sacrifices for such an extraordinary event to become a real possibility? It was a brave stance to take, and Yamamoto soon found himself the target for death threats, which came not only from extreme nationalists, but also from the Japanese army, and military police were even dispatched to follow his movements. Nevertheless, it was fast becoming increasingly clear that Japan was being propelled towards a conflict with America, and the army at least recognized how valuable Yamamoto would be in the event of them going to war. While Japan made plans to protect their Asian empire, across the globe, fierce battles were being fought between Italy and Great Britain on the deserts and plains of North Africa. As Mussolini's forces tightened their grip on the supply route through the Mediterranean, it became increasingly difficult to get all the logistical backup that was required through to the British troops, and Churchill ordered that swift action be taken. As early as 1938, when Hitler had threatened to seize Czechoslovakia while Europe stood on the brink of war, the British had begun making plans to strike the Italian fleet based in Taranto. When the Munich Treaty was signed by European leaders, averting the conflict for another year, the offensive was postponed, but now once again, British commanders started to make preparations for their mission. The attack on the Italian fleet was groundbreaking, as it was the first all-aircraft naval attack in history and took the Italians completely by surprise. As well as achieving secrecy, the British had also developed special torpedoes that could be dropped from low altitudes that would work effectively in the shallow water of the Italian bay. The technique had never before been used in naval warfare, and in one night, half of the Italian fleet was destroyed. Far away in Tokyo, Yamamoto was deeply impressed by the offensive and was inspired to devise his own strategy in Japan's war. If there was no option but to fight America, they would cripple the US naval fleet before it advanced west. Japan would attack Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto began to analyze the attack on Taranto down to the minutest detail, and soon the Japanese began developing special torpedoes just as the British had done, because they would be ideal in the shallow water of the Hawaiian harbor. While the Japanese made preparations, the American public were becoming more concerned about the war in Europe. For months, they had listened to the British battle against the Luftwaffe's relentless air attacks brought to their living rooms by American reporter Ed Murrow's newscasts from London. They had heard bombs tearing through the air as civilians hurried to air raid shelters and stumbled to the safety of the London Underground. American families had listened to British families, fighting for their survival, as Hitler kept up the relentless pressure of the Blitz, and many were touched by the words of Winston Churchill as he declared, "We shall never surrender." America was facing the facts. Neutrality was probably not going to be an option for them for very much longer, in a war that threatened to plunge Europe into the abyss of a new dark age. By June 1941, the war was spreading further across the European continent, as Hitler sent a vast Nazi army marching into the Soviet Union, reneging on the non-aggression pact he'd agreed with Russia before storming into Poland back in 1939. Now both Churchill and Russia's leader Joseph Stalin turned to Roosevelt, and it was ever more likely that the new world, with all its power and might, would have to come to the rescue of the old. While conscripted men in America continued their training for battles that they were unsure they'd ever fight, and supplies were shipped to Britain and Russia, Roosevelt warned the public that the United States will never survive as a happy and fertile oasis of liberty surrounded by a cruel desert of dictatorship. But the American president was propelling his people ever closer to conflict. He announced the formation of a Philippine army and put General Douglas MacArthur in command of all military forces on the islands. He then made a startling move in an attempt to halt Japanese expansion by freezing their assets in the United States. America's lead was soon followed by Great Britain, and it became virtually impossible for Japan to purchase oil, which presented a huge problem, threatening their plans to expand into new territories dramatically. In August 1941, Churchill and Roosevelt met off Newfoundland to discuss the situation in Europe and the Pacific. The treaty they signed advocated freedom from want and fear and the disarmament of aggressor nations. Coupled with America's embargo on oil supplies to Japan, the Atlantic Charter may as well have been a declaration of war, and one Japanese newspaper described it as a blueprint for Anglo-American world domination. On September 6, 1941, at a rare imperial conference overseen by Emperor Hirohito, the Japanese Supreme Command decided that if negotiations bore no fruit, by October the empire would go to war. Though Prime Minister Konoye had encouraged the vision of an Asian empire, he was very reluctant to go to war with America. He urged a meeting with President Roosevelt, offering to travel to Hawaii's capital at a moment's notice. But all Konoye's attempts at diplomacy were in vain, and by October the 18th, his government had fallen and the Minister for the Army, Hideki Tojo, took charge of Japan. With militarists now assuming total power, the last hope for a peaceful solution evaporated. With eyes turned to oil reserves in the Dutch East Indies, Tojo stepped up preparations for war, and Admiral Yamamoto dutifully set to work finalising plans for the attack on Pearl Harbor. Air crews began training with great dedication, though few knew details of their secret mission, while on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, Japanese delegates continued negotiations in Washington with the American Secretary of State, Cordell Hull. By the beginning of November, Yamamoto's attack force was ready, and the Japanese emperor, who was equally reluctant to go to war with America, approved the plan to strike the US Navy. Vice Admiral Nagumo was appointed as commander of the operation, and the date set for the attack was December 7th, 1941. Yamamoto would remain at his base in Hiroshima during the offensive, but before the carriers left the shores of Nippon, he spoke to his men, wishing them success for the coming battle. He filled them with courage, but in his heart he knew just how difficult an enemy America would be to defeat. Slowly, ships which would compose the Pearl Harbor attack fleet began to disappear from Japan's home waters, heading for their rendezvous point in the freezing Kurile Islands to the north of Japan. In the meantime, preparations were made to launch simultaneous invasions of the Philippines, Guam and Malaya, from where the Japanese could attack Western colonies around the Pacific. Movements of Japanese ships were monitored by American intelligence, but no one seemed to realize that beside the threat to the Pacific Islands, an enormous task force was heading for Hawaii. On November the 20th, the Japanese ambassador to the United States, Admiral Nomura, presented Japan's final ultimatum to America's Secretary of State, Cordell Hull. It required the USA to resume supplying Japan with oil and to cease aid to China. As Hull began composing his reply, Tokyo cabled its ambassadors in America, warning that they only had days to reach an agreement before it would be too late. While the ambassadors waited, on November the 25th, Yamamoto ordered the Pearl Harbor Strike Force to leave the Kurile Islands and head to the icy waters of the North Pacific en route to Hawaii. A day later, Cordell Hull handed his reply to the Japanese ambassadors. Japan must withdraw all forces from China and Indochina, and in return, Japanese funds would be unfrozen and trade would resume. They were not terms that the Japanese were willing to accept, and back in Tokyo, those who favoured diplomacy realised that negotiations would have to come to a close. As the Japanese fleet turned east and drove through the gales and fog of the high seas, the sailors and commanders at Pearl Harbor had no idea that an attack was imminent and went about their daily chores. As US and Japanese relations had deteriorated, the naval base had been put on high alert, and there'd been plenty of maneuvers and mock airstrikes to prepare for a possible attack. However, the commanders based in Hawaii didn't realize the gravity of the threat to the harbor, and there were few real precautions made for its defense. It's interesting to note that along the west coast of America, in San Francisco, an intelligence officer picked up unusual transmissions emanating from the west of Hawaii. He assumed it was a Japanese fishing fleet, and nothing further was done about it. Nevertheless, it was one of many clues that, had it been picked up on, might well have averted disaster. On November the 18th, the US Navy cracked a secret code enabling them to decipher information sent to the Japanese ambassadors in Washington. It announced that, in case of emergency, the following warnings will be added to the middle of the daily Japanese news broadcast. North wind, cloudy, would mean war with the Soviet Union. West wind, clear, meant war with Britain and its colonies. And east wind, rain, represented war with the United States. If Japanese delegates on foreign soil heard this weather report, they were ordered to destroy all code papers. From Singapore to San Francisco, British and American intelligence went into frantic overdrive, listening out for the message which could provide a vital warning of an attack. What's more, tensions were building in another arena. The German foreign minister, von Ribbentrop, had told the Japanese ambassador in Berlin that Hitler would join the war immediately if Japan began a conflict with the United States. Tokyo, in turn, informed Germany that the time of this war may come quicker than anyone dreams. It was December the 1st, and Roosevelt was well aware that a peaceful conclusion to relations between Japan and America looked more unlikely by the day. With intelligence desperately deciphering communications around the globe, suddenly Japanese diplomats in Washington, London, Manila, Hong Kong and Singapore were ordered to burn their codes. This not only meant that diplomatic relations had ended, but war was about to begin, and still no one knew where. Venturing ever closer to Hawaii, the Japanese fleet crossed the path of a Russian ship on December the 5th. All guns were trained on the Soviet vessel, ready to fire, as Nagumo had been ordered to destroy any non-Japanese shipping that came in contact with the strike fleet. However, Japan's foreign minister, Matsuoka, had signed a neutrality pact with Stalin earlier that year, and the vice-admiral ordered his officers to let the ship pass. The Soviets, meanwhile, silently watched the huge Japanese fleet advance towards American soil. By now, Japanese ships had been spotted off the coast of Thailand, and the British commander of the Far East Fleet, who was in Manila with General MacArthur, immediately flew back to Singapore to rejoin his ships and await possible attack. In Hawaii, life went on as normal. American service personnel played golf and football, and on the night of December the 6th, sailors relaxed in the bars and clubs. Many were dancing to the sounds of the Navy's musicians in a Battle of the Fleet dance bands. Ironically, the men playing in the competition were given permission to lie in the next morning, but the band of the USS Arizona would never see another day, as none of them survived what was about to happen. Meanwhile, a 13-part message from Tokyo to its embassy in Washington had been intercepted by American intelligence. Before even the Japanese ambassadors had a chance to decipher the contents, Roosevelt read the intercepted papers himself and realized that Hull's offer had been rejected. The president said, "This means war." But the message was incomplete, and it wasn't until the next day that the 14th part actually arrived. At 4:50 a.m. on Sunday, December the 7th, Japanese submarines stealthily entered through the harbour gates. They were reported and a hunt began, but a general alarm was not given. Less than an hour later, on the other side of the Pacific, the Japanese were busy starting another battle as they attacked the British-controlled territory of Malaya, but the authorities in Hawaii remained totally unaware of the hostilities. In actual fact, the Japanese commanders had planned for the two invasions to begin at exactly the same time, but an officer's error led to a slight change in plan. As events unfolded, back in the USA, General George C. Marshall, Roosevelt's military advisor based in Washington, had received the decoded 14th part of the message, which confirmed negotiations with Japan had ended. Yamamoto had wished to abide by military law, giving notice of an attack, and had ordered the Japanese ambassadors to take a message saying negotiations had failed to the White House by 1 p.m. This would mean 7 a.m. in Hawaii, giving a full hour's notice. Marshall sent word to Pearl Harbor to be on the alert, but his message would arrive too late for the Americans in Hawaii. while Ambassador Nomura called Cordell Hull at the White House to set up his 1 p.m. appointment. Soon after the Japanese attack began on Malaya, radio transmissions between the carrier fleet and Tokyo ceased, and at 6:15 a.m. Admiral Nagumo gave the order to release the planes. The first wave took off from their carriers in a giant swarm, and the very same flag that had flown during the attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur all those years earlier waved triumphantly from the lead ship. At 7:02, a trainee at an Opana radio station on the northern tip of Hawaii spotted a massive formation heading straight for them. The operator rang the fighter control center, but as a flight of American B-17s were expected from the mainland, he was told to forget it. The morning sun was rising lazily over Hawaii as a gentle breeze wafted through the harbour and streets of Honolulu. Most were asleep after a Saturday night out, and some were still awake, entertaining their friends. Those who were up early and doing their morning chores would see the first wave of planes casting their shadows over Pearl Harbor. It was 7:55 when the first bomb struck. The initial targets were the airfields. The planes didn't have a chance to get off the ground, as the incendiary bombs fell swiftly on their targets. The Japanese had achieved their objective, taking the Americans by surprise, and were overjoyed at seeing the planes and ships all neatly lined up. One Japanese pilot exclaimed, "Haven't the Americans heard of Port Arthur?" And as US servicemen leapt into action on the airfields, the message, "Air Raid Pearl Harbor, this is not a drill," was broadcast, while the Japanese cried, "Tora, Tora." It meant Tiger, indicating the attack had been a surprise. More planes had now started to attack the American ships. The torpedoes, developed for shallow depths, sliced through the water, hitting their targets with precision. Bombs screamed through the air, obliterating all in their path. Men aboard the battleships had little chance to defend themselves as they awoke to the terrifying sounds of explosions shattering the morning calm. Within minutes, battleships all around the harbour were ablaze, and the USS Arizona was engulfed in flames as the lives of over 1,000 sailors and Marines were lost. Pearl Harbor was utterly unprepared for such an attack. Guns were unmanned, and those who rushed to the ammunition supplies found them under lock and key. As a second wave of planes roared overhead, sailors seized what they could to fight back. Many began firing on the planes with machine guns and pistols in a desperate attempt to defend their fleet. The Japanese were astounded at how unprepared the Americans were for such an attack. But as the second wave of planes approached, they would face more resistance from the US troops as they began to man the guns. Many heroes would later emerge from the chaos of Pearl Harbor, one of the most famous being Doris Miller, a mess attendant aboard the USS West Virginia, as well as the ship's captain, Mervyn Bennion. As the smoke and flames filled the morning skies, a bomb had exploded on the deck of the West Virginia, showering the captain with shrapnel. Doris was instructed to carry him to safety, but Bennion insisted on giving orders from the deck until his death. Despite having no training, Miller seized one of the anti-aircraft guns and began firing at Japanese planes until there was no ammunition left. There were a number of Japanese planes shot down as Marines and sailors fired at the swooping aircraft, but the casualties suffered by Nagumo's pilots were few compared to the devastating losses of the Americans. All around Pearl Harbor, civilians who had at first thought the explosions were part of military maneuvers quickly became all too aware that it was not a practice. One reporter, waking to the sound of anti-aircraft fire, jumped onto the phone, asking the press officer at the other end, "Who is it, Harry? You don't think it's the Germans?" This just confirms how unexpected the Japanese attack was. And as the battle continued at Pearl Harbor, many civilians were killed or wounded, hit by shells raining down from the skies. While the US ships were consistently hit and casualties continued to rise, stateside by 9 AM, the Japanese envoys were walking up the steps of the White House. It was now 2 o'clock in the afternoon in Washington. They were late, and news of Pearl Harbor had already reached Roosevelt. Secretary of State Hull received Kurusu Nomura coolly, but then unleashed his fury at the message that stated negotiations had failed. Ironically, they would later vow that they had no idea that Pearl Harbor was to be attacked. By 10 AM, the skies over the Hawaiian harbour were clear, but the ground was a seething mass of smoke, burning ships, and people scurrying to and fro, tending to the injured. Over 2,400 Americans had been killed, 21 ships had been sunk, almost 200 aircraft had been destroyed, and 5 of Pearl Harbor's 8 battleships were sinking or heavily damaged. Only 29 Japanese planes had been lost. However, the Japanese weren't finished. Vast oil reserves and fleet repair facilities hadn't been destroyed. Nagumo's junior officers urged a third wave to finish the job, but the admiral was reluctant to incur further losses, and fearing they would run low on fuel, he turned the ships around and headed for home. Nevertheless, Japan had missed out on one vital element in this engagement. The major aircraft carriers weren't at Pearl Harbor when Japan struck. One, carrying Admiral Bull Halsey, was returning from delivering planes to Wake Island. But upon hearing of the strike, he vowed to avenge his fellow Americans killed at Pearl Harbor and would spend the next 3 years pursuing the Japanese all around the Pacific. Admiral Yamamoto would later acknowledge that the failure to order a third strike had grave consequences for the Japanese in the Pacific War. But for the time being, the whole of Japan joined in with the celebrations. In the immediate aftermath, Roosevelt resolved only to declare war on Japan, while waiting to see if Hitler commenced hostilities before taking America to war with Germany as well. But while Honolulu was still reeling from the attack, 9 hours after the first strike, the Japanese began bombing the American base in the Philippines. General MacArthur, who was defending the US position there, had in point of fact a much more sustained Japanese onslaught to resist than had been the case at Pearl Harbor. When Japan invaded the Philippines 3 days after the first bombing raids, they served notice that this was going to be a hard and bitter fought campaign. On December the 8th, 1941, as crowds of people gathered outside Congress, President Roosevelt made a brief address which would be broadcast throughout the world as the USA officially declared war on Japan. Shocked and angered by the loss of so many of their fellow countrymen, the American people cheered their president, now ready to join a war that after Pearl Harbor had become truly global.
That since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
All that remained now was for America to await Adolf Hitler's response. The Fuhrer was at his Wolf's Lair headquarters on the Eastern Front when the news of Pearl Harbor came through. The German armies were retreating from Moscow, and the war against Stalin and the Russians was not going well, with the Nazis sustaining horrendous casualties in a campaign their Fuhrer had been convinced would be quickly won. However, Hitler was comforted by the Americans' declaration of war on Japan, and because he was so certain that his pact with the Japanese would now make him invincible, he made a bold statement. "We can't lose the war now. We now have an ally which has never been conquered in 3,000 years." On December the 11th, Hitler spoke for 90 minutes, furiously insulting Roosevelt, giving a speech which he concluded by declaring war on the United States of America. It was a rash move, taking on the greatest financial power in the world, as well as the Russians and the British. For perhaps the first time, the people of Germany, who had in the early years of the war been prepared to follow wherever Hitler led, began to wonder whether their Führer would be able to deliver his promises of a 1,000-year Reich. As Winston Churchill rushed across the Atlantic to join Roosevelt in the preparations for what lay ahead, there were still questions being asked amongst the military. Why had the commanders at Pearl Harbor not been better prepared? The Commander-in-Chief of the US Pacific Fleet, Husband E. Kimmel, along with the commander of the US military in Hawaii, Walter Short, were demoted and found themselves blamed for what happened at Pearl Harbor. In their place, Admiral Chester Nimitz took over command and rewarded those who had fought so bravely at Pearl Harbor. Among them was Doris Miller, who was the first African American to be awarded the Navy Cross, the third highest honor awarded by the US Navy. Nimitz would play a crucial part in the war in the Pacific. Despite the fleet's terrible losses, it would soon be ready to storm into the islands of the Pacific and reclaim the land lost to the Japanese. But for now, Japan celebrated their triumph while the wrecks of the US ships were hauled from the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor. They had provoked the mighty American war machine to roar into action. While the Japanese battled against the troops of General MacArthur in the Philippines, the man responsible for planning the attack on Pearl Harbor, Admiral Yamamoto, was far from optimistic, despite the undoubted success of the operation he'd devised. Yamamoto was one of the few Japanese commanders who really understood the true power of the Americans, and although defeated on this occasion, he was well aware that they would be back to fight another day, stronger and more determined than ever. As the conflict in the Pacific started to unfold, Yamamoto knew that the war Pearl Harbor had triggered was for the Japanese already lost.